Kellyanne, can you offer clarity on this phone call President-elect Trump apparently had with the president of Taiwan? Do you know what was discussed?
So publicly, I would just like to say whatever is in the readout and what's been publicly disclosed is really the only thing I'll have to say on the matter, Anderson.
I mean, the reason I'm asking, as you well know, is the U.S. doesn't recognize Taiwan as its own nation. There's obviously a strong unofficial relationship. The U.S. views Taiwan as part of China, doesn't support Taiwan independence. U.S. president hasn't apparently spoken to a leader of Taiwan since 1979. I think there's a tweet now from the Democratic Senator Chris Murphy who said these are major pivots in foreign policy without any plan. That's how wars start. Can you say if this does signal some sort of a shift in the president-elect's strategy vis-a-vis China or Taiwan?
Well, it sounds like Senator Murphy's tweet is pretty incendiary and does not signal much of a shift from what seems to be the doctrinaire Democratic response to the election results. I mean, this is how wars are starting, and it's a major policy shift because he had a phone call. That's pretty negative and pretty presumptuous.
But there is a widespread belief that this is something which China takes very seriously, and this has been longstanding U.S. policy toward China not to recognize Taiwan.
Right? But again, I can't discuss anything beyond what's been publicly said, and I won't do that. And this is the president-elect. This will be his administration. He'll be commander-in-chief, and he'll be president of the United States imminently now. And he either will disclose or not disclose the full contents of that conversation, but he's well aware of what U.S. policy has been.
There have been questions raised about the briefing materials that President-elect Trump has used in phone calls with world leaders, whether or not he's used State Department briefing booklets and information and the expertise of people in the State Department that's been available to him. Can you confirm if he did consult that before this phone call?
I can confirm that he has access to those materials, and he has access to daily briefings. He has access to other information that comes to him from official government agencies and
Does
elsewhere.
he use it, though?
Of course he uses it. He reads everything. I mean, the guy, he's the busiest guy on the planet, pretty much has been for a while now. But as president-elect is fully engaged, works, just pours the time in, has talked to, he and Vice President-elect Pence have talked to probably about 45 or 50 leaders now, or met them. He's talked to probably 80 people or so as advisors, folks who are offering their counsel, their experiences, their vision. He takes information that is given to him and provided to him. He avails himself of any number of different information sources, including those that come from the State Department, including those that come from intelligence briefings. So
is there, just in terms of how it works, is there a policy before talking to a world leader or the president of Taiwan that he would be briefed by the State Department, or that he would make sure to, be fully up on Taiwan's unofficial relations?
Well, you're presuming that he's not, and I don't remember any of these questions ever being asked about President Obama or President-elect Obama. I think 8 years ago at this time.
Well, he's never spoken to the president of Taiwan, so this is the first time, so it is new, so that's why I'm asking.
Sure, but as President-elect, I'm pretty certain that President-elect Obama spoke to world leaders in preparation for taking over as President of the United States and Commander-in-Chief, and I can't imagine that he was asked here or elsewhere if he had been properly and fully briefed, considering that he had very, very little experience himself.
But this is a break with U.S. policy.
I
mean, this is uncharted waters, not since, for decades.
Anderson, President-elect Trump is fully briefed and fully knowledgeable about these issues on an ongoing basis, regardless of who's on the other end of the phone.
How is the structure right now in the transition? Where would where is the discussion coming from of whom he should be having phone calls with? How does that actually work?
Well, that just works in a very orderly fashion. It's a matter of the executive committee. It's a matter of the president-elect, the vice president-elect, other advisors to the transition making suggestions, and we're happy to schedule the calls. There's a very orderly process. We make sure that there is plenty of time for those phone calls, that there's proper briefing, and so far they've just gone really well in terms of dozens and dozens of phone calls and a few meetings with world leaders by Vice President-elect Pence and President-elect Trump, all the while being very sensitive to the fact that we have a current president and current vice president still in office. he at least is having these private conversations, giving a readout here and there about them, but not trying to make policy and not trying to make waves until he's actually the president in 6.5 weeks.
I mean, I guess that's the question, whether a phone call with the president of Taiwan, which is a major shift in U.S. policy, or, just having that direct contact is in fact making waves. There's another piece of CNN reporting. A different administration official says there was no contact with either the White House or the State Department about the call beforehand. Can you confirm that?
I can't confirm that, but I can tell you yesterday there was a major shift in policy in that Donald Trump and Mike Pence went to Indianapolis and helped Carrier broker a deal that kept 1,100 employees here. Why is that relevant? Because that's a major shift in policy. The current president could have done that. The current vice president could have done that. They just did not do that. And you see these major shifts in policy. Taiwan is different than that, certainly. But I can't confirm particular intimate details of phone calls that are being had between the president-elect and world leaders. I just won't do it.
And obviously we did a lot of reporting on that yesterday, particularly as well as both President-elect Trump and Vice President-elect Pence, their thank you to the beginning of their self-described thank you tour. Just finally, can you comment on the Pakistan government released what they said was a readout of the phone call between President-elect Trump and Pakistan's Prime Minister. It was a one-sided readout. It was only allegedly what Donald Trump had said, not what the Pakistan Prime Minister had said. Was that accurate? And it was very unconventional for Pakistan to do that. It was a break of protocol. Was that something which was concerning to the President-elect?
Well, we would prefer that any time something like that is done, that you get the full benefit of the entire conversation, to the extent that both sides had agreed to a readout. But again, he's having these phone calls, he's having these meetings. He will do that again as president with world leaders, certainly, as will Vice President Pence. But in the meantime, beyond what is publicly disclosed, I just cannot disclose anything further than that. It would be highly inappropriate for any of us to do that. So I'm going to have to stick with that. I can talk about a lot of aspects of the transition, can talk about many aspects of the campaign manager forum in Harvard last night. I can talk about a number of different policies that the president-elect is very focused on for his first 100 days when he gets to Washington. But I can't and I won't disclose any further details on private conversations, let alone private conversations that the president-elect is having with world leaders.
Kellyanne Conway, appreciate you being with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
I continue to ask Kellyanne Conway some questions about that Harvard symposium from yesterday. We're putting
Wisconsin, and in Michigan even narrower, just 82,424 total votes. Now I want to bring in CNN political commentator David Swerdlick, CNN political contributor Hillary Rosen, and KBC Talk Radio host John Phillips. All right, here we go. Good evening to all of you. Hillary, there is no denying that this was an ugly campaign and there are some hard feelings, but should Democrats move on now?
Well, the whole point of this session was to actually look backwards, and so I think it's inevitable that the pain and suffering would have been coming to the forefront. Look, this was actually razor thin, and I think knowing, and it gets more razor thin every day as the votes are finalized, and so this is a team that worked their butt off for 2 years, gave up a lot, and believed in this, and it was personal. And Kellyanne said something that I don't necessarily disagree with her when she said, look, we realize that voters care more about what affects them than what offends them. That's a good line. But I think that what was happening for the Clinton team, for our side, is what was said was affecting us and was affecting our people. And so I think it made it extra personal.
Mm-hmm. Why'd you say it was a good point, David?
Well, I think Hillary's right on that score. Kellyanne Conway, again, she did have a fair point there, but right, maybe voters voted for Trump because he was talking about things that affected them versus offended them, but there were millions and millions of people out there who were offended and took offense at Trump calling Judge Curiel, saying he couldn't do his job because he was Mexican.
That affects Mexicans.
Right.
Well,
That
wait a second.
affects Mexicans, not just
Well,
offends them,
Not just
offends them,
offends.
but it
Yeah,
affects them
yes,
as a society.
it affects and offends.
Right.
Yeah.
President-elect Trump being, at one point at least, the public face of the birther movement, on and on, et cetera, et cetera. So I think Kellyanne Conway has a basic overall point that Democrats need to look to the future. But I think that Democrats, including Jennifer Palmieri, have a point that the Trump campaign ran a very divisive, at times nasty campaign.
Do you think, John, I want you to weigh on this because he said it's a divisive, nasty campaign. People said it was vicious. He mocked, belittled, ridiculed people, insulted women and minorities, told an awful lot of lies about Hillary Clinton, his opponents, about the press, the whole electoral system. And as Kellyanne Conway, I think, admitted there, they said, people are more concerned about what affected them than offended them, so they weren't afraid to offend people. Is he responsible for the bad feelings that remain?
Well, look, partisanship has existed long before Donald Trump. This campaign was vicious. The primary was vicious. Campaigns in the past
This
have
was
been
different than
vicious.
just partisanship. I mean, you
Well,
have to
I
agree
think
with
the larger issue as to why the nerves are so raw with a lot of the Clinton folks is that they never expected to lose. They went into Election Day thinking they were going to win. They thought that Donald Trump was a joke. They treated him like a joke. They didn't think that he had a credible campaign that had any shot at all at winning any of those industrial Midwest states. He ended up pulling it out, and I think they were shell-shocked. And what you saw at that forum at Harvard was them repeating the same mistakes that they made during the campaign.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of looking in the mirror, looking at the mistakes that they made, they're attacking Donald Trump. They're continuing to go after him. And what have the Democrats done since then? They reelected Nancy Pelosi as minority leader in the House. They elevated Chuck Schumer.
You're echoing what Kellyanne Conway
Right,
said.
and Keith Ellison at the DNC.
But
And that's not going to help them win these white working class
All right,
voters
so
that they just lost.
To give you that point, and I think that you have a point there, I think that Kellyanne has a point there as well. But do you think that do the Clinton folks have a point about the nastiness of the campaign, about the fake stories, about the negativity, about what Hillary and David just said about what may be, affect people, or may just be you think is offensive to people? It does affect their lives. When you say that the first black president should show his birth certificate, that affects African Americans.
Look, the general election wasn't any nastier than the primary election. The primary was a very vicious process, and many of those
That's
people
not an
have
answer
been
to the
brought back
question,
into
though.
the tent.
I mean, John, quite honestly, that's not an answer to my question.
Look,
Well, Don,
it
also,
was.
Don, if I
You're
can just
answering
say,
my question. Hold on, David. You're answering
Yeah.
my question about the election with another question about the election.
No, I'm saying elections are nasty all the time, and people get over it.
Yeah, I agree with that. But this was quite different. Come on, John. We sat here for what, 18 months, and said, "Oh my gosh, I can't." Some of the things that Donald Trump said, you couldn't even believe he said it.
Well,
But,
many
you know,
of
I
those things, by the way, were said in the primary.
Yeah.
The
I do
John
think
McCain
that
remark
that
was
was
said in
a-
the primary.
The
Yeah.
common denominator in the primary and the general was Donald Trump. Again, he won the election fair and square, and I agree with John that Democrats need to start looking forward.
Right.
But I don't think it's wrong for Democrats to point out some of the divisive language used by Trump and others of his surrogates, both in the primary and the general.
But part of I think the frustration that boiled over in these last 2 days, and that we're talking about it again, is we made a big mistake as Democrats in sort of chasing the bright, shiny object of rhetoric. We really thought that was going to be enough, that somebody who acted this way would never be elected president. And polls showed repeatedly, and the exit polls showed, people didn't think he was fit to be president, but they voted for him anyway.
Well, that's what John just said.
That's my
yeah.
point. And so what I'm saying is, I think as Democrats, we thought that was going to be that was the campaign. It wasn't the campaign Hillary Clinton started. She started a campaign on education and family medical leave and equal pay and criminal justice reform. And we ended it on, this guy just can't be our president. And so I think that the point that Kellyanne made that our team had a hard time hearing yesterday, because it's painful to hear, is, you know what? People really just don't care when you insult them, when you insult other people. There weren't enough people who cared about insults. Really, the change issue, just like wanting something different, moving away from the current administration, was a more powerful message, and I think that just hurt.
Yeah.
At a certain point, too, Democrats are going to have to acknowledge the elephant in the room, which is they nominated a bad candidate.
Yeah. I got to go. John,
Joe
hold your
Biden
thoughts.
And especially for Cuban Americans. I was with my dad when he found out the news that Fidel Castro was dead, and he simply said, "Praise God." You know, for so many of us whose families have been imprisoned, have been tortured, have seen the destruction of Cuba that Fidel Castro carried out. My dad, as a teenager, was imprisoned and tortured by Batista. He was beaten in a prison cell, had his teeth kicked out of his mouth. My aunt, my Tia Sonia, whom I adore, she fought in the counter-revolution against Castro, and she and her two best friends in high school were thrown in prison and tortured as teenage girls, and was unspeakable. And you know, I first heard that Castro had passed a final judgment with a text from my cousin Bibi, who's my Tia Sonia's daughter, who just said that she got to call her mom and tell her mom Fidel is dead. And for a man who has tortured and murdered and oppressed for so many, it is thankful that he is no longer with us.
So many powerful stories like that. You know, you put out a statement paying tribute to Castro's victims, those who'd fought against him. Do you think his death will open a new chapter with increasing liberty for Cubans? What happens next?
Well, look, that is certainly my hope and my prayer. Unfortunately, the policies of the Obama administration have made that less likely. What the Obama administration has done is strengthened Raul Castro. Raul is the dictator now. You know, I asked my dad at dinner last night, well, what do you think happens now that Fidel is dead? And he shrugged and said, Raul's been in charge for years. The system has gotten stronger. And what Obama has done is funneled billions of dollars to Raul Castro, which is being used to oppress dissidents. You know, in 2015, roughly 10,000 political arrests occurred in Cuba. That is 5 times as many as occurred in 2010, when there were only about 2,000. This tyrannical regime has gotten stronger because of a weak president, weak foreign policy, and it is very much my hope and belief that with a new president coming into office in January, President Trump, a new administration, that U.S. foreign policy, not just to Cuba, but towards our enemies, whether they are Iran or North Korea, will no longer be a policy of weakness and appeasement, but instead using U.S. strength to force and press for change. But I look for the day, you know, I've never been to Cuba. I've never been to the land where my father was born, where he grew up. I look forward to coming to Cuba, but to seeing a free Cuba where people can live, where it's pulled out of.
So do you think the embargo was working?
Time forgot.
Do you think the embargo was working? Do you want to double down on that?
You know, what I will say is the economic pressure was having real effect. Cuba was a client state of the Soviet Union for many, many years. When the Soviets collapsed, it put enormous economic pressure on Cuba, but then Venezuela stepped in and provided petrodollars in exchange for troops. When Venezuela's economy was cratering, President Obama stepped in with billions and is propping up the administration. This ought to be a moment where Cubans are dancing in the street because they're being liberated. But instead, listen, if you dance in the street, you're going to be thrown in jail. Cuba is not a free society. You know, in 2015, some 2,000 churches in Cuba were declared illegal. 100 were destroyed by the government. You don't have the freedom to worship God, to speak. And it is my hope that we will see U.S. strength prompting real change and real freedom in Cuba.
Let's turn to President-elect Trump. You met with him last week in Trump Tower. You said you want to work with the new president in whatever capacity you can have the greatest impact. What capacity might that be?
Well, listen, we've got a lot of work to do. This election was a mandate for change. It astonished everyone. It astonished the pundits. It astonished the pollsters. And it was an overwhelming mandate. It was over 300 electoral votes. It was winning all across the Midwest, states that had gone Democratic for years after years after years, states like Pennsylvania and Michigan and Iowa and Wisconsin. We have a mandate for change. And Republicans have been given the opportunity We've been given control of the White House, of every executive branch, and both houses of Congress. We can't blow it. We have got to deliver. And so I'm excited about working with President-elect Trump, working with the new administration to actually deliver on the promises we've made, to repeal Obamacare, to lift the burdens on small businesses, to unleash energy.
Well, on that point, Senator Cruz,
confirm strong, principled, conservative Supreme Court justices.
Since his election, Mr. Trump has changed his tune on some of those issues. He said he wants to keep certain provisions of Obamacare instead of repealing and replacing the whole law, that mankind may be causing climate change, and he's open to abiding by the Paris Accord, and that same-sex marriage is settled law that he would not try to have the Supreme Court overturn. Do those changes in his tone concern you?
Listen, what I'm going to work to do every day is to try to work closely with the new president, with the new administration, and with my colleagues in Congress to deliver on what we promised. I got to say, if we don't, if we're given the White House and both houses of Congress and we don't deliver, I think there'll be pitchforks and torches in the streets. And I think quite rightly, I think people are so fed up with Washington. This election was a mandate with change, and the most catastrophic thing Republicans could do is go back to business as usual. And I'll tell you, there are a lot of reasons to be encouraged.
So do you have real concerns about what he's
The new team Trump is bringing together, listen, the new team that Trump is bringing together is an impressive, serious team. Jeff Sessions is Attorney General. I know Jeff. I've worked closely with Jeff in the Senate. Jeff is a smart, principled, serious conservative. I think he's going to make an excellent Attorney General. You look at the national security team that's coming around the Trump administration. It is a strong, serious national security team. So I'm encouraged by the team that is coming together, by where their focus is. I'm encouraged by their plan for the first 100 days to act aggressively, lifting the burdens on small businesses and job creators. That's what the president should be doing. And from my end, I want to do everything I can to help President Trump have an incredibly successful administration, because if we deliver on the promises, that's how we actually turn the country around, bring back jobs, and raise wages for people that are hurting.
I also want to just go back a little bit, back to the campaign, which at times was very bitter. You had some very strong words about then candidate Trump. Listen to this.
This man is a pathological liar. He doesn't know the difference between truth and lies. He lies practically every word that comes out of his mouth. The man is utterly amoral. Morality does not exist for him.
Do you regret any of those words?
Well, listen, it was a hard-fought campaign. It was hard-fought on all sides. And it was vigorous till the end. But at the end of the day, the people have spoken. He won the election. He won the nomination. And he won the general election in convincing manner. And my focus is on the country. My focus is we have a new president. We have a mandate. We ought to deliver on that mandate. We ought to deliver. This election was about jobs. It was about the fact that for the last 8 years, working men and women in this country have seen their lives, they've seen wages stagnating, they've seen factories closing. We need an administration that fights every day for the working men and women of this country. That's my #1 priority in the Senate, fighting for 27 million Texans, for jobs, for economic growth, to raise wages.
I just want to go back to those words. He lies practically every word that comes out of his mouth. Do you still think Donald Trump is a liar?
You know, I'm not going to relitigate the past. I'm going to focus on the future. I'm going to focus on what's in front of us and on fixing the problems we have. I will say one thing, Martha, that's going to be an interesting test just in the next few days. I very much hope that we don't see any U.S. government officials going to Fidel Castro's funeral. I hope we don't see Barack Obama and Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton and Democrats lining up to lionize a murderous tyrant and thug. If you wouldn't go to Pol Pot's funeral or Stalin's funeral or Mao's funeral because they were murdering communist dictators, then you shouldn't be doing what Barack Obama and Justin Trudeau are doing, which is celebrating Fidel Castro, a murderous